So for the next hour or so, we're going to talk about some strategies for early Hamilton County research. Some of the things we're going to talk about are very specific to Cincinnati and Hamilton County, and other things we're going to talk about will hopefully apply to if you're researching another county. Put a lot of things together in 1 hour. So the first thing is when we talk about early, what do we mean? And I thought an operational definition that's good to use is 1850. So that before that, if you're used to using the census, it only has the head of the household, and it only has the categories by age, so you don't get every name in the household, you don't get the place of birth, and you just get a range of ages. So it makes it harder to put families together, making sure that you got the right families and strategies and so forth. And the other thing to keep in mind is, we're used to Cincinnati today. We're probably, 32nd, 34th size in the country. But back in the 1800s, in the 1840s and 50s, Cincinnati was the 8th largest city in the country. So it was a lot more strategic importance. It was the Queen City of the West, so there was a lot of activity on the river, up and down. As you come up through New Orleans, St. Louis, people took a right turn to Cincinnati to go inward. If immigrants were coming from Europe, they typically went to New York or Baltimore or Philadelphia, came across the mountains to Pittsburgh, came down the river, and then to Cincinnati. So a lot of the commerce, a lot of the trade that went back and forth came through Cincinnati. And then as you get into the 1840s and 50s, the Miami-Erie Canal from Cincinnati up to Toledo. So then that corridor started to open up for a lot of settlement and traffic. So it's important to realize, if people only stopped here for a couple years or a generation, why they did that and why Cincinnati was such an important place. And then when you look at December of 1788, when the first settlers arrived at the landing, public landing, already in 1790 we had the first courthouse established for the Northwest Territory, so less than a year later. Of course, it was a simple log cabin type of establishment, but it was still very early. We had a place to record deeds, buy and sell. There was a need for courts, probates, and so forth. And then as far as churches are concerned, already in 1790, the first Presbyterian church was established, so we start to see organized religion coming in. And then the first newspaper in November of 1793. And that still exists today, and it's still available. So, if you're researching in other states, in rural counties and so forth, you may not get your first newspaper till the end of the 19th century. It may not survive, only parts of it survive. But early on, we have lots of newspapers and lots of material that's available. So I thought, how do you organize things when you're for 1850? And you're trying to put your research strategy together. I thought about how you organize things and how do you put your strategy together. And these are the categories that I came up with. I mean, there may not be ones that you think of, they may not be the best, but what I tried to think about is you got government records, and you start with the federal and work downwards. So at the federal level, you got the census. Every 10 years, you've got military records. As we hit wars and veterans were called up from the militia and so forth, those created records, those created sometimes pensions, sometimes there was bounty land given to the veterans after the war. So all those can help, and it's an important resource to tap into. And then land grants. Early on in the 1820s, Cincinnati had a land office for the federal government to sell land in Ohio. There was another one in Brookville, established right around 1823-24, that sold land in southern Indiana. So again, right away, the government's setting up the appropriate bureaucracy to support the settlers into this new land. And then when you look down at the state and the county and the local levels, you have tax lists. And unfortunately, that we found there was taxes that were assessed every 3 years and recorded. None of those survive that we can find right now. But I've used them a lot in rural counties and other states in Kentucky. Sometimes the tax list survived to the founding of the county in the 1700s. and it gives you a year-by-year account of your ancestors, what they own. And a lot of times, too, if you look in the tax list, if the landowner had a son who was over 21 that was still single, they listed him. So right there, you would get a relationship between the son and the father, and then when he turned 21, he would appear in the list, so you have his age. So it's an important thing to think of. Land records, again, when you look at the courthouse, probate records, you've got civil court records and cases, you've got criminal court cases that a lot of times we don't think of our ancestors being criminals, but the reality there, either that they were a victim of crime or they were the perpetrator, but it gives us another record to look at. We've got marriage licenses, we've got vital records, and then delayed records. So a lot of times the state of Ohio started keeping vital records in 1908. But when you think about when Social Security came in, people had to prove their age to get the retirement pension. And a lot of people that were born in the 1860s, 70s would bring a witness in or another family member who would vouch for them, and they would record that as a delayed birth record. So those are other things to look at. When we talk about the second category, church records, again, in Cincinnati is a wealth of information, and we're going to talk extensively about those, particularly in the early periods. But when you think, again, the church records, again, you think of the usual, your baptisms, marriages, burial and death records. But you also look at confirmation records, if those were kept. Because a lot of times, as people move around, you won't find a baptism record, but you would find a confirmation record that would lead you back there. You have membership lists, so certain congregations didn't record what we would call sacramental type of information, but they would have membership lists of people that joined and left. You would have introductory letters. So the Presbyterian Church in particular, we had an article in the Tracer a couple years ago of surviving introductory letters from First Presbyterian. We'll talk about those a little bit later. You've got probationer lists, so if people show up, you can either have a letter of introduction from your previous church that says you're a member of good standing and you're leaving. Please accept them into your church. But if they just showed up and says, hey, I want to join, you had to take some classes, you had to make sure that somebody vouched for you within the congregation and so forth. So you were on probation. And those are there as probationers. That's what that means. Session minutes. So again, the elders that ran the church and did the finances and so forth, they kept minutes of their session. Financial records, and we're going to show some examples of really how those could pay off. Sometimes churches charge for pews, pew rental lists. Dismissal letters, again, if somebody left the church and they wouldn't want to go to another congregation, they would need a dismissal letter. And then anniversary booklets. Sometimes we forget about those, but in the late 19th century, early 20th century, as churches and congregations were their 50th, 75th, 100th anniversary, that was a source of pride, and they published anniversary booklets that essentially sometimes had the whole history of the church, original members, a lot of the auxiliary societies and so forth. And so that's an important thing to look for if your ancestor belonged there. You could get some of the ancestors and information from there. The third category is newspapers. And again, Cincinnati and Hamilton County has tons of information to talk about. We could have several sessions just on that alone. But usually you think of obituaries, and that's the first thing everybody thinks of. But we're going to talk about early resources. You've got local news. You've got missing persons that were published and looking for people we're looking for. We've got missing animals, and we're going to talk a perfect example of how that helps. It seems kind of silly today, but you've got public notices. You've got probate record notices. You've got court summaries. And then when we think about today, we have the Enquirer. We have one paper for all of Cincinnati and Hamilton County, but in the 19th century, there was dozens. And if your ancestors were ethnic, so the German, Italian, Irish, a lot of times they had specific newspapers that catered to them, and you're going to find information in those newspapers versus an English newspaper. You have religious newspapers, so the Methodists had one, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians had one for a while, the Lutherans, Catholics. So all the major religious denominations had papers, and if your ancestors were a member of those, you're probably going to find information in there about them. And then specialty newspapers. So there was all things on households and beer brewing and so forth, that newspapers had all kinds of specific things. So again, if your ancestor was a beer brewer, you would probably want to look in a paper like that to find information about it. And then the fourth category was just about everything else. So you think about, city directories. We don't have tax lists, but we have city directories that every year listed who lived in a specific address, and as children got older and got jobs, they would be listed too. All the city directories are here. They've all been digitized online, so you can view them from home. Local histories, again, Cincinnati had several histories. Ford's History of Cincinnati was published in the late 1800s. We have an every name index available for that history. It's several hundred pages long. And then there was 3 specific local histories in German that were published at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. So again, if you're doing German research, we'll talk about this afternoon, that's something to think about and look about. You've got cemetery records. A lot of our cemetery records have been microfilmed, and we're up to volume 22 now of the series of recording all the burials in Hamilton County. You've got lineage societies. We're having our lineage luncheon in a couple weeks for the fall. So again, check other research that people have done on Hamilton County ancestors. They have submitted their papers that may help. And as you do that, you're welcome to submit your research and share it with others. Pioneer societies, so we're going to talk a little bit about that, some specific examples. That was a club that was very prevalent in the mid-19th century. You had to prove residency before 1812, later 1815. And of course, then the society began to die out as all the original members couldn't prove before 1812. But there's an extensive list and booklet that was published on that. The Germans had their own pioneer society, which again has been indexed and available. And then you look at, I'll say this public trees, Ancestry, Family Search, and I would caution that is you're going to have to take that with a grain of salt. Again, there's a lot of garbage out there. There's a lot of good research. But if you find your name, your ancestors on an ancestry tree, for example, make sure that the source of the information is cited. If there's no documentation on it, you can use it as a hint and then go try to find the original source to prove it. But anybody can put anything out there and share anything. So it's a great help, but it's also a word of caution. And then maps and gazetteers. The public library here in the genealogy department has one of the best map collections anywhere in the country or our region. You've got DNA analysis. Kathy Reed right here, she does the monthly DNA interest group. I'll just touch on that later on, but that's again a whole set of lectures and series that you can dig into. And then the Cincinnati History Library and Archives is going to be opening again in February, March of next year. That's a lot of original manuscripts that are available for Cincinnati and Hamilton County. It's a wealth of information. Take advantage of that when they open up. And then social media, so Facebook, Twitter, things like that. You can find things on interest groups. Sometimes if you have a famous name, you'll find a Facebook group on that ancestor or so forth. If you've got Smith or Jones, it's probably not going to be too much help. But then Google searches. So a lot of county histories have been digitized over the years. Google search on that name may help and find something in a history that you have no idea existed before. And then when you get stuck, the fan club, the friends, acquaintances, and neighbors, expand your search to people that always seem to be in baptism records and witnesses on land deeds, neighbors, and so forth. They keep popping up. There's probably they traveled with your ancestors. If you can't find anything directly about them, maybe you can find something on them that will lead you back to the original place. And then, of course, if you're back early enough, the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons of the American Revolution, they have an extensive library, and you may tap into some research that people have done before. So what I would propose is, when you talk about the GPS, the genealogical proof standard, they claim that you need to do a reasonably exhaustive search or now research to prove your case. And I would think that what we've got outlined here constitutes a good beginning to a reasonably exhaustive search. So the first tip that I would say is, start with the website. We've done a lot in the past 3 or 4 years to put a lot of information online. It gives you a good start and a good overview of what's available, particularly if you just start at local records and you go down births, cemeteries, county directories, and so forth. If you don't know where to look or where to start, that's a good place to get a handle on what's available, where it is. Some of the things have been digitized, some of them have been microfilmed, some of them are here, some of them are original manuscripts or at the offices. But it gives you a good place to start for where those records are. And then the tracer is all back online, digitized for members back to 2008. So again, you can go back to any of the tracers and look at previous articles and so forth right from your own home. So I think that would be the first thing, is just, and we're going to go through some specific examples later on. So we go with government records, and the first one is the census. And for those of you that have been doing genealogy for more than 20, 25 years, me included, you remember the old Soundex system, where you had to come down and look up your name, go get the roll of microfilm, use the Soundex, and then try to find the census. But I think it's worth mentioning, in the environment that we deal with today with Ancestry and so forth, it's so much easier just to put a name in, do a smart search or a fuzzy search for a name, and it pops up. But if you're using paper indexes or indexes that were generated quite a bit ago, and you don't find a name, if you use the hint that used to be in the Soundex, a lot of times you can find names. So letters or names that begin with D, P often get switched in indexes, or they sound alike. The same things with last names that begin with C or K. When you think of names, first names like Carl, it could begin with a K or it could begin with a C. You're not going to find those if you're looking at an index of your name, and those have been switched. A lot of times names that begin with a C or a K can also be interpreted as a G. I've seen that lots of times. And so you see some examples over there of common names that are phonetically the same, but if you pronounce them in your head, you can see one spelling one way or the other. Even the second one, Kavanaugh, we've seen in the news recently, he spells his name with a K. So again, if you're looking at an index in the front of a book or something, make sure that you don't find your name right away. You kind of look at these strategies and interchange some of these letters here and look at the index for that. A lot of times you find it. So what I thought we'd do is it always helps to go through some of this as an example. So when I was putting the charts together for the Pioneer Society, I saw this and I thought, well, let's just pick a name and we'll do the recording secretary, and the guy's name was Stephen Wheeler. So it's just a name at random, and I thought, as we're going through some of this, let's see what we can find out about him and his family early on. So again, the first thing is you start with the census, and you get every bit of information out of it that you can. We used to call this was a census run. So you pick a name, and you just go through every census that you can find him or his family, and you write down what you find about it. And the first one, I started with 1850, and I found him in Cincinnati in Ward 3, which is, it turns out that's near the river, down where the U.S. Bank Arena is today. And then I went to 1860, and I found him, but you notice the name isn't Wheeler, it's spelled Whaler. So again, you start getting them at phonetics and how it sounded to the census taker, or how he was able to spell the name. But you see the relationships are pretty much the same, the age is matched, the place of birth, so we think we got the right family. Go to 1870, don't find him, so that could be significant. Either they could have moved away or they could have died. You don't know yet. And then we go back in 1840, sure, we find him. We go back in 1830, we find him, again, living pretty much in the same place. So we think, well, maybe they owned a house they were pretty much staying put. We noticed some inconsistency then in 1830 that his age is, it should have been 30 to 39, it's 20 to 29. So again, it's something to investigate. What is his true age? Sometimes as people get younger, they report their true age, and as they get older, they kind of get creative. So that's something to keep in mind. And then in 1820, we don't find him, but we find a lot of other people with the name Wheeler. And we start to look at, what people in that household would have a male child about the right age that could be a candidate. And we see one, a Jacob, with, it comes up there, that would have a male child that would be the right age. So again, we don't have proof yet, but it could be a working hypothesis of where to go to next. But you see, we kind of get everything we can out of the family, what we know about them, their children, and so forth, and then we can move on to the next step. So when we talk again about military record or government records and military, you need to look at pension records, you need to look at service records. Find a grave is a good means of looking up those type of things if you don't know where they're buried. And in Hamilton County in particular, we're very lucky in that there's been a Make a Difference project for the last couple of years to document all veterans buried in Hamilton County, not necessarily served from Hamilton County, but buried in Hamilton County from World War I prior. So we're all 1812, Revolutionary, Mexican, Civil, Spanish American, and now there's a group of volunteers working on World War I veterans. It should be completed next year. So those indexes are on our website. They're all free. In parallel, there's been Find a Grave memorials that have been created for each one of those veterans. And then volunteers have gone out, and if they could find a picture of the stone, they put it on Find a Grave, so you can actually see the original stone. And there may be a lot more information there. But the other thing to think about is, from Claremont County over to about Chillicothe, early on this was called the Virginia Military District. And after the Revolutionary War, a lot of the Virginia soldiers, in lieu of payment, they were given land in that district. And that spills over into part of Anderson Township in Hamilton County. So again, if your ancestor came real early and they were in Anderson Township, they may be a Revolutionary War veteran, but they may also come from Virginia with that group when they came in. So again, it's tips like that to keep in mind depending on where they came, how early. But again, check the website if you've got a veteran. You can get a lot of information pretty quickly from those indexes. And again, when you start looking at courthouses, start thinking of tax lists, start thinking of land deeds. If they were farmers, they would have had to buy land, they would have had to sell it eventually or dispose of it. That creates a record. And again, when you're selling land, if the couple was married, husband and wife, the wife would have to agree to give up her dower right. So her name would be on the deed of sale. So again, before 1850, if they were selling land, you're going to get the wife's name when they sold their property. Look at probate records for wills and estates. When you get civil court records, you're going to get civil cases where people were suing each other for property, for goods, for disputes. Divorce records, again, those would be there. Criminal court records, again, if your ancestor was involved in any kind of crime, that would go through criminal court. And then marriage licenses, those would be in the probate court. But again, remember, before 1940, if your ancestors were Catholic, they could have gotten married through the bands versus a license. That's a separate index. It's a separate process to go through. So there's another set of indexes to check if you don't find their marriage license. And then vital records. So the county started about 1890 with births. They were sporadic. But if your ancestor lived in the city of Cincinnati, the city started keeping death records in 1865. They started keeping birth marriages in 1874. So again, that's pretty early in the relative speaking. And there are cases, and we'll talk about that in a minute, where from the mid-1820s to 1841, the city of Cincinnati kept death records. So again, if you've got early ancestors, that may be a good thing to look into. 41. So again,
41, I'm sorry.
yes, 1841. So again, you know, if you've been around Cincinnati and Hamilton County for a while, you know we had a fire in March of 1884, and a lot of information, unfortunately, was destroyed. But a lot we're finding is still available in pieces. There's been a lot of work that Jim Dempsey's done on going through all the inventories of other records that are available. We've recreated a lot of the marriages through church records and newspaper records. We're finding a lot of court records, cases that were published in newspapers. So we're trying to fill in the gaps little by little of information that was available at the courthouse. It isn't now, but it still could be for your ancestors. So we'll go through some of those strategies too.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, good point to say that property records, they ran to get those out of the burning courthouse first. And even though some of them were burned, a good part of the book still exists. And so there is still every property book record from 1794 to present available.
Yep. So that's the next slide. It's a perfect introduction. So if you're gonna research land deeds, here's the website for the recorder's office. And again, spend some time there. If your ancestor was a farmer, or even if they owned a house, they would have had to have a deed to buy or sell it. And you see some of the books go back to 1787. They're all there. A lot of them have been digitized now. Retrieved older ones. Just, what was it, Jim, 2 months ago? Now we've got an index from the oldest book back for the grantees from the original book.
Yeah, hopefully I'll have that up within the next month.
It's done, but we just have to post it.
Yeah.
Okay. So look for that. So again, if early ancestors deeds, we're going to have a lot more to come in the next couple weeks, months on indexes to check. But again, I think this is the best site to start with. There's indexes on it. There's a lot of the early ones have been digitized and scanned, so you can even check that from home to get an early deed. The next thing to try is the probate website. And again, you see all the stuff that they have, wills, estates, guardianships, marriages, death records, birth records, and so forth, and the dates when they start. Now, they may not all be complete, but it tells you where they are, what time frame they began, and a lot of those are online. So the marriage licenses, again, they're all scanned. There's indexes online, so you can do that from home, and it'll bring up the original marriage license right there. Again, with wills, we've generated an index that's on our site for a lot of the early wills, if your ancestors left one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another key point on that is that the probate dockets, the list of when your ancestor died and the estate was probated, exists complete back to 1850. So, and the society indexed a lot of the surviving indexes now. So again, don't believe 1884 is an absolute tell.
Yep. Did you hear that? Okay. Question?
Are the original probate packets available?
No. We've tried to find those. They were donated at one time to the museum center, and we followed up. And I remember this that they said when they were delivered to them, they had infestation. In other words, they were in a warehouse, and so they just had to destroy them. They were in poor condition, and they were. Yeah,
Full of bugs.
right. So.
Full of bugs.
And so what to look at too is when you get in the early period, even though an original court record or court case may not be available at the courthouse, we've tried to recreate as much as possible from newspaper accounts of the day. And every day they went through and listed the cases that were up for that day in circuit court, superior court, probate court. Sometimes they have a lot of detail, sometimes they don't. But again, it's indexes to try to see if your ancestor was listed there. And sometimes there is a lot of information. We'll go through a couple cases in a minute. So right now we've got 1870 to 1879. Those cases have been extracted and indexed. And then next year, the final 1880 to 1884 before the fire, we try to recreate those. So again, those books are here. If you've got those kind of cases where you're trying to research, it starts in 1841. And again, the data was extracted from the online cases of the Cincinnati Enquirer. So again, if you get the citation, you can look it up, the original at home online, if you've got a public library card. Again, marriages, there's been a lot of work done before 1900. We've generated a whole bunch of indexes. Again, they're all available here. The ones before 1885, we'll see in a minute, they're on our website. If you remember, you could do a search, a wildcard search, to try to find your name from home, which makes it a lot easier too. And so we start there again. We go back to our Wheeler family, and we know from the census, Stephen and his wife was Catherine. We don't know her married name. So again, we go on the website. Under the marriage index, we type in the name Wheeler, and we don't know her name, or her last name. So if you use a wild card, and I'll just put in C-A-T-H, because it could be Cather Run, C-A-T-H-A-R-I-N-E, or E-R-I-N-E, and see what you come up with. So you always want to start your search with the exact name. If you can't find it, then you back off and you start using wild cards. Right away you see it was an extracted or a restored marriage record from the courthouse fire. And part of it probably had his first name was burned off, so you have his last name, but you have his wife's name, and her maiden name was Piatt, P-I-A-T-T, and it gives their the date the marriage license was taken out in 1822. So again, from home, you can quickly find information on their marriage. It'll lead you to the original marriage license extract. It may not have a lot more information, but now you've got a date when the family started. So if we move to church records, I mean, is there any questions? I could probably start a little faster. We're running out of time here. So again, the next category is church records, and again, Cincinnati, it's a great resource. A lot of times when you go to localities, they have proved that churches existed, but there was no records kept. They were lost. They were very simplistic. But we have it almost right to the very beginning. And the easiest thing, I think, to start with is the LDS or the Family Search website. And you go there and you click on right away search, and then go to the catalog, and then you just type in Cincinnati, and it'll ask you, okay, there's a couple different Cincinnatis, but the one for Hamilton County, Ohio is the one you want. And you see all the different things that are available for Cincinnati, for bibliographies, for cemetery records, for census, and so forth. Right there, when you see church records, it lists 103 churches that have been microfilmed by the Mormons or Family Search. So that's probably the easiest thing if you're trying to figure out what's available early on, what records there are, where are they at, and so forth. That would probably be your first stop. And then we go to baptisms. So again, a lot of them have been indexed. We've got a series of births and baptisms for non-Catholics up to 1900 here. For most of the ones that have been microfilmed and are available. So that would be the first thing to check. But again, start thinking, if you look through the indexes and you can't find things, there's a lot of different variability in names, interpretations of names. Make sure that you be creative if you can't find things right away to make the most of the index. And then always go to the original record. So the original record may have additional information on the actual date of birth, versus the baptism. It may have godparents' names, which would be other clues for a relationship with the families. And I put this in as an example is when you deal with indexes and you look down the page like this and you see names all typewritten out, nice, it's easy to read, and you think, well, my family name is a little bit different. Is it the right name or not? Maybe instead of this Maria Greneker, it was spelled different. Roennecker, for example, is we traditionally spell it. Well, you got to get back to the original record, and when you do, in this case, and you look at this and you think, well, am I as confident now that whoever indexed that got the name right? So you got to get back to the original record. You look at it, and then you've got to make sure yourself that you've got the right person or not. When you look at something like this, it's really hard to say, did they get it right? And you can rationalize it yourself. Again, like this, you start from an index and you find a name and you think, oh, good. And then you go to the original and you think, in this case, this is written in German, in the old German script. Is it as easy to read? Are you as confident that you got the right person or that they did? So again, make sure that when you use indexes, don't just think, hey, I got it, I'll move on. Go get the original record. It may have more information. It may have a lot more information. You may see some inconsistencies in how things are spelled in relationships. And then here's a couple other examples when we were going through and generating indexes. Here's an example of the German church, St. Michael's in the West End, where there was a baptism of an Irish couple, and James McCarthy, he spelled it Jacob, M-I-C, with a little up arrow, K-A-R-T-E, and instead of Sullivan, it was Sullivan. So, he was not familiar, obviously, with the name, kind of spelled it phonetically. You start seeing different variations, and it was, I'm sure they knew their name. It was a German priest that was trying to interpret the names that were very unfamiliar with them. And so, again, things to consider. And then when you look at, again, the original records, you've got issues with smudged ink, ink that's light and faded and you can't read. In this case, you've got missing information from the page that it was blotted out. And so you're going to deal with a lot of different things as you go through that. But the more that you can look at, particularly baptisms, every 2 years it seems like families get kids. You can sometimes put things together a lot more completely. So if we move on to church records, and here's an example of what we talked about before, financial records. And this is from the Methodist Church here in town, Wesley Chapel in 1813. And you can see the entries there. It's for John Stahl's grave paid by E. Hall for $6. So isn't that really a death record from 1813? So you've got somebody buying a grave for him in a financial record, and right below it, he buys another grave for Mr. Evans on December 17th. So again, you're not going to find a death record that early, but in the financial record, you're going to find somebody paying for a grave, which is just as good. Here in the membership list, you see names of people joining in July of 1813. They were admitted on trial, so again, they didn't have a certificate with them. They just showed up and said, we want to become members. But again, isn't that proof of residence? They showed up and they wanted to join the church in 1813. And then down below, you see couples' names. So again, you're not going to find in a census the wife's name, but if they're joining as a couple, man and wife, you're going to get her name along with the couple. And again, these records start pretty early, and this example was from 1813. So again, it's being creative, membership list, financial list. Again, here is an interment list. It's not a burial, but it's pretty much the same thing as people that were being interred in the Methodist cemetery here in town. They had to pay the fee, and the sexton was more concerned with the accounting to make sure that he got paid for it, reported it. And then on the right-hand side, you see an example of a letter of introduction. So from the Presbyterian Church here in town, at the top it said, this is certified that Joel Scribner and Mary, his wife, are members in full communion and in good standing in the Presbyterian Church in Rutgers Street, New York City. And then it goes on, but it's a record from 1811. So there again, they came here to Cincinnati, they joined the First Presbyterian Church, they had a letter with them that showed they were in good standing, but now you know where they came from. Even got the street and the congregation in New York City. And again, most of these were published in the Tracer a couple years ago. You can March in 2016. So if you have early Presbyterian ancestors, this would be a good thing to check. All of those records have been microfilmed again. And they're available down here at the Mormon Library. And then this is another interesting one. We talked about church records and civil records. In this case, it was a church court for people misbehaving. They were hauled in front of the elders and the minister. And you see the plaintiff who was accusing them, the defendant who was being accused of misbehavior, what they were accused of, and then were they found guilty, not guilty, and then were they expelled or they repented. And you can see some of them are kind of funny for today, for immoral conduct of fighting, using profane language. I love this one in the middle. Immoral conduct, furnishing bad women for bad men.
What's neglect of class? Is that actually stratification?
No, it's so we talked about if you didn't have a certificate, you just showed up, you were on probation, you had to go to classes to learn how to be a good Methodist. And if you just came to a couple sessions and then didn't show up anymore, you got put on the bad list for being truancy in class. And then, you can see down at the bottom, a couple women were accused of attending the Mechanics Institute ball and dancing. And what's interesting is they were guilty, but they repented. They promised not to dance anymore, so they were allowed to stay. But again, it kind of shows you, this is from the 1830s. If you can find stuff on your ancestor, it's a good story. But again, it's a good proof, and you have relationships to try to build on. So that's churches. Again, it just gives you an introduction of what you can find and where to dig. Yes.
Is there any news on the Catholic records that's supposed to be released?
Sure.
I forget the name.
Right, find my past.
Yes.
So the question was, is there any update on the Catholic records? And yes, there is. They've come to the archives. They've taken all the microfiche. They've scanned it all. The latest is they're still processing it, and the goal is to have it all up and operational on their site by Roots Tech of next year, which would be about February. So within, I would say, 4 or 5 months, all the Catholic records up to 1920 for the whole archdiocese will be online. The good thing is what we're trying to do is negotiate with them. So if you're a Hamilton County chapter member, you would get a discount to join Find My Past because they want a lot of our indexes for the material. So we'll have pay attention to the Gazette, the Tracer, as we get more information. We're still negotiating, trying to sign a MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, to move forward. But the actual records, the microfilm records, should be online by February, March of next year. Yes. No. That's why they want our indexes. Their goal is to eventually index them, sort of like crowdsourcing, or I'm sure pay a service to index them. But when that would be finalized, there's no date on that. Yes.
I noticed that they had on the site the new index for baptisms from 1850.
Yep.
So I looked for my ancestors that I know were here in there, and they're not there. So are there a lot of records missing from the archives?
So you were certain they were in Hamilton County. So
St.
there,
Michael's Church, probably, or St. Joseph.
So there, I would start looking for the alternate name spellings. The thing that we were looking at is right now it's complete everything that we know. We're finding that if they were in one of the orphan asylums, those were run by religious organizations, and those aren't included with the archdiocesan records. So we're trying to hunt those down, but it's complete that we know.
Okay, so do you know if the archdiocese said that there were missing records from certain years?
We've run across when we're going in chronological order, some of the churches have had gaps in the microfilm. In other words, when they were microfilming it, they would turn 2 pages at once, and we've gone back and asked for the original copies to make the index as complete as possible. All right, so now we'll go into the newspapers. And again, this is really a gold mine for Cincinnati and Hamilton County researchers. They start very early. We've got lots of them that have been microfilmed. There's lots more of the original ones, and particularly the old original ones that were never microfilmed, that are available at the Museum Center, again, when they open in March. And so what I would recommend is, if you're researching in Hamilton County, if you're researching in another state or another county, is go to the Library of Congress website. So it's Chronicling America. And when you do, you see the site that comes up like this. It's called Library of Congress. And then the easiest thing to do, I think, is to go over here where it says Newspaper Directory 1690 to present. Click on this tab, and it opens up a screen like this. And then down at the bottom here, you select your state, you select your county, and you select your city. And then it gives you a range. So if you're looking for, in this case, I put prior to 1850, and it lists all the newspapers that were ever documented or published. And then it gives you information as whether they're still in existence, what portions of them are in existence. In other words, it could be a complete run or a fractional portion that survives, and then all the repositories that have copies of it. So again, it's something to try. Here, you're at the library. If you're in the museum center, it's easier just to look at the card catalog, perhaps. But if you're researching in another county, another state, and they tell you there's new newspapers that survive that may not be in that county, but there may be in regional archives or another repository that they don't even know about. Maybe the Library of Congress themselves have copies, and it'll tell you that here. So it's a good place to start for information. Sure. Is it in your handout, or did I would say just, I think it's www.loc.gov. But if you just Google Library of Congress, or I think Chronicling America, it'll come right up. Right. Oops. It's right here. Probably can't read it, but Chronicling America. Just Google that, and it'll come up with the URL. So again, we start off with what everybody usually goes to is obituaries and deaths. And again, early on, Cincinnati had a lot to offer. Usually, when you think of obituaries today, that was a Victorian thing. So you think in the middle of the 19th century and later, when Queen Victoria lost her husband, she was in mourning for the rest of her life, and so this whole culture started to develop about wearing black and decorating houses in black and obituaries and photos and so forth. Before that, it wasn't quite as common. You do see quite a bit in newspapers early on. And in this case, it's the National Republican. You've probably never heard of that newspaper, but it was a fairly big one in the 1830s. And typically what you're going to get is something like, died on Saturday last in Delhi Township in this county, age 52. This is Ann Williams, wife of Peter Williams, Esquire. She had for many years been a pious member of the Methodist Society and died in full hope of a blessed immortality. So again, it's not much, but it does give a lot. And you know that she was married, list her husband's name, list her age, that she was a resident of Delhi Township, so you would start thinking, okay, where do I go for land records? They probably owned a farm. What Methodist churches were around in the western side of the county in Delhi or closer in, to start looking for other records. And it gives you a date of death. And the other thing is Peter Williams, Esquire. In the 19th century, that was usually a term for somebody that owned land. So again, start looking for land deeds, when did they buy the property, and so forth. And there's a bunch of other examples. Some of them that says, he, William Sayre, age 33, he left a wife and 2 children. So again, at the time of death, he had 2 kids to start to look for. So again, make sure that you get everything out of it that you can. And then if you're lucky enough, this is an example of probably the best you're ever going to see. Died of consumption, so you get the disease at midnight on the 17th inst, so that means the same month when you see INST. So it's the 17th of June, the day before. The widow, Sarah Jackson, formerly of Boston, Massachusetts, age 53. Her funeral will take place tomorrow at 5 o'clock from the residence of her son-in-law, Abraham L. Voorhees, on Pike Street. The friends and the family of Joseph Pierce, the brother of the deceased, are requested to attend the funeral without further notice. So you get, her age. It doesn't say she was born in Boston, but she said she came from there. So that would be the next place you would start to look for. Gives her age. Gives her son-in-law, so you know that she had a daughter and that her daughter was married. They lived on Pike Street, which is down near the river. And then you also get her brother, which gives you her maiden name. And that her brother lives in town. So it's like you got basically everything you'd ever want to know. And this is from 1838. And we talked a little bit earlier. This was, for a period of time between 1828 and 1841, there was an ordinance in the city council that every cemetery sexton had to report burials. We don't know whether those records survive. It would be a city hall because it was a city record. But whether they're still in some closet somewhere, we don't know. But the good thing is they were published every week in the newspaper. And so in the extract, we'll talk about it in the early newspapers, volume index. Those are all extracted, and it's the name, their age, sometimes the cause of death, and again, it was for everybody. So this, you didn't have to pay to get in the paper. It was the sextons had to report it by law, and they published it in the paper to the city clerk. In this case, it was John Gibson. But the good thing is this guy John Chamberlain, they specifically gave him as a non-resident. So he may be passing through town, staying at a hotel, and died. But they made note of it. And also too is if you're doing African American research. You know that it's hard to find things, but right there it said Melindy Henson, colored 9 years. So again, if you're trying to do African American research, this was just anybody. They didn't discriminate, you didn't have to pay and so forth. This could be an incredibly helpful resource to try to look at. Again, probate notices, you may not find a death notice, but if they own land or any property when they died, the case had to be probated. And then what they did is to make people aware if you owed money to the estate or you were owed money, they published it in the newspaper a couple weeks before the case came to trial. So here's a list of all the probate cases for the previous quarter that were coming due. Again, those have been extracted. So it could give you an approximate date of death, where to look for them. And this is from 1828, so again, pretty early. Also, to look for in advertisements, this is a guardian sale, so somebody died, they had left minor children in the estate, so a guardian has to be appointed. The guardian selling the property to help pay for the care of the children. So he wants to put an ad in the paper to make sure as many people are aware and pay the highest price. And then again, if they own property and their case went to probate, a notice was typically put in the paper. If you see an administrator or administratrix, it means they died intestate, that there was no will on the property. If you see an executor or executrix, it means they left a will. So the TRIX meant it was a woman. In this case, Sarah Armstrong was the administratrix. Say that right, but close enough. And typically those were the widows. So you've got, again, a good case for who his wife was at that time. And this was in 1810. So again, very early, something to look at and check for. And so this was a case before we talked about with the missing animal. And this, check the date, 1796. So the first surviving census for Ohio was 1820. This is 24 years earlier. And this is a guy that put an ad in the paper. It's called the Freedmen's Journal. It still survives today. He's complaining. It says, trespassed on the subscriber about the 21st of November. A dark red cow, about 8 or 9 years old. Marks a crop of each year and a half penny under the right with red and white on her face. She's been running around since last May. The owner has desired to prove his property, pay charges, and take her away. So he's pretty irritated. This cow showed up on his land, probably trampled his fence and his crops. He wants the person that owns it to come and pay damages and take the thing away. And it also gives his name, Levi Jennings, Duck Creek, Columbia Township, 1796. So isn't that proof of residence? You know that he was there, owns land, somebody's cow's coming on. He's going to be irritated. He's put a notice in the paper for somebody to claim it. The other thing is they went to, in this case, if a stray horse showed up, a cow, a pig, they would go to the local justice of the peace, report it. The justice of the peace would put an ad in the paper. And why? Because that was proof that if the owner showed up and accused him of stealing it, they could take him to court for stealing his horse or his cow or whatever. Well, if they went to the justice of the peace and said this stray showed up on my land, that protected them. They put an ad in the paper to notify that. So again, when you look this early, where else are you going to get proof of residence for Hamilton County? But again, you think about these are farms out in the wilderness. They're not going to have white picket fence. It's probably a simple rope or something that the cow's going to trample down. But again, start thinking of those kind of things if you're stuck. The other thing is, when cases went to court, in this case it's a partition for real estate, so somebody died. There's a bunch of people that inherited the land. They're probably all children. And there's a dispute. So they want to sell the land to get the money. Some of them want to sell it, some of them don't. But it lists all the inheritors and their wives because they were all part of the suit. They inherited the land. So again, 1830, you've got sort of a family relationship to go after now if they inherited the property. Divorce laws before 1840, if things didn't quite work out, you had to go to the Supreme Court of Ohio to file for a divorce. Again, that was a costly process to hire a lawyer, go to Columbus, or wait till the court made its rounds and come here. And again, you had to publish in the paper why you wanted the divorce. And it was very strict. I mean, you couldn't say things didn't work out. So it lists the reason, typically, of why, and it lists the couple. And then whether, once the court was held, whether the divorce was granted or not. So again, if you're finding in census records that people were suddenly alone and you can't find proof of death, maybe this was an alternative explanation. Earlier on, if things didn't work out, people just said, walked away from it. They didn't want the expense of getting a divorce and so forth. And so again, to protect yourself, they would put public notices like this in the paper. And it's kind of funny. It's, he says he's complaining that his wife left his bed and board without provocation. And he's saying, hey, I'm not going to pay for any of her expenses from this day forward. So if she makes any commitments and so forth, you're at your own risk to accept the note from her because we're going our own separate ways. So again, it's in this type of environment, you look at the date 1819, again, an 1820 census, and you see her by herself, now you know maybe why. But the interesting thing is you look at this date, it's February 6th, and it gives, again, his name and the date Reading. So he's out in the sticks in Reading, Ohio. Again, proof of residency. But the funny thing is the next day or next week, she puts a notice in the paper, and her notice, as you can see, it's on the front page. And it says that she's left him because she owned the property before they got married, and he's pretty much of a bum, and if you want to set the record straight, I left him. So Again, it's a pretty gutsy woman that takes out an ad on the front page of the paper to try to set the story straight and say, I'm the one that has all the brains and the money and the land, and I'm getting rid of him. So again, a lot of things that you can find early on if you did. And then again, advertisements, a lot of indentured servants. They floated down the river. In this case, on the right, the guy left Pittsburgh. His name is Andrew Durling. They're looking for him in Cincinnati and Louisville. They suspect he floated down the river to escape. And this one a little bit later in 1854, William Colgan left a will, Taylor County, Kentucky, and they're looking for a runaway slave. So again, Cincinnati was on the Underground Railroad. A lot of them, the slaves that were leaving from Tennessee and Kentucky, came up through Cincinnati, up into Ohio and Canada. And you see a lot of advertisements in the paper for runaways. Again, the good news is a lot of these newspapers have been indexed. All the indexes are here, public library. In particular, the ones, the Daily Gazette, that starts in 1827. This one here, the Enquirer starts in 1818. Liberty Hall, which again was a really big paper, that starts in 1804. This is a combination of 23 early newspapers starting in 1793, and most of the examples that we talked through is from this one, index. And then if your ancestors were Methodists, one of the big initiatives was started by William Nast for the Germans in 1837. He came to Cincinnati, set up a Methodist congregation for Germans, and then started publishing a national newspaper. And then every week, his whole network of ministers submitted obituaries, and 85 to 90% of them listed the place of birth in Germany. So if you've got German Methodists, not just in Cincinnati, from anywhere in the country, that's a good index to check out. So we'll skip this. We're running out of time. So talk about the last category, and we'll go real quick. We're running out of time. This could be easily an all-day lecture to go through all this. But again, start looking at city directories and go year by year to try to track people. And of particular note is, remember, 1850 was the first census that had place of birth in it. But if you look in city directories, if you wasn't on this certain showing up. Anywhere on
Try aiming it here. Try aim it this way. There we are.
So 1825 and 1840, those city directories listed the birth of each person. So again, it was the state or the country. So again, 1825, that pushes you back a lot farther. If they lived in Cincinnati, you're going to get the state or the country that they were born in. 1829 is the first year for a street directory. 1834, 40, 42, 44, they listed separate lists for colored persons or free African Americans that were living in the town. So again, if you're doing African American research, those are the ones to look for. 1853 was the first one that had house numbers. And so that's where you start to get the system of house numbers running from the river up. But it's important to note that in 1895, they changed all those numbers to the system we have today, that every block jumps by 100. And so it could be still in the same house year after year, but in 1895, the numbers changed. So it's an important thing to remember. But again, it's on the website under city and county directories. It's all open and free. Local histories, again, Ford's history of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. There's an every name index on the website to check out. Sometimes, your name, your ancestor's name was in there. That's an easy thing to find. And then quickly, we go back to our Wheeler family. We try to find a death certificate for him. We look in the city death records, which are all online and scanned at the Blagan Library on the UC's website. We find one for him, says he died in April of 1870, which explains why we didn't find him in the 1870 census. Says he's buried in Spring Grove, so we go to Spring Grove Cemetery, which is a great online resource. We find a card from him, we get his birth date, where he was born. We notice he's in a family plot. And again, if you manipulate their website, you can put in the plot number and it shows you all the family members that were buried there. And you start looking and you see that some of his younger children that died in the 1820s were reburied there in the family plot in Spring Grove. And it notice there at the bottom it says they were reburied from the Presbyterian Cemetery on 12th Street, which is today Washington Park. So again, it tells you they were Presbyterian. You start looking at Presbyterian records. The family was there earlier, so now you have proof of that. And you can start to put everybody together, all their children, their birth and death dates, and in this case from the census, from the Spring Grove records. You get her married name, the date name from before. It lists her parents and says she was born in Elizabethtown in 1803. And then you look at Elizabethtown is in Whitewater Township, so you look at Volume 5, which is Crosby and Whitewater Township, and you see all her parents and her siblings that are buried there. And again, a lot of information, very early. You've got now back into the 1700s of when their parents were born, both of them in New Jersey and Kingdom. When you look in the Pioneer list in the Pioneer Society, that was an article we just published in the Tracer earlier this year. You see his name in those lists. It gives their birth date. It gives the date when they showed up in Cincinnati, and then the place of birth. So again, they had to prove that relationship when they joined the Pioneers. And then you also start looking for the Cincinnati directory for other people that were born in New Jersey as good candidates for his parents or other family members. Maps, again, the library here, we have a great collection of maps. So we look at Ward 3, which is where the census said they were at. It said he lived on Pearl Street. So when you see on the map, here's the river. Here's the river down here. This is Front Street today. This is Pearl Street. Here we have 3rd Street. So it's right here. And their house was right in this little pink area right here, one of these. So again, it can put you right where they lived. And it makes it a lot more interesting for family histories if you can pull these old maps out and find out where your ancestors lived in relationship today. The rest of these is, it's in your syllabus, DNA, ancestry, all these other things to make sure that as you get stuck and you hit your brick walls, that you try all these other resources to try to put the picture together. But I think we hit on a lot of the big ones to start to look at. So in the future, just to give it a hint, this one, the court records from 1870 to 79 is already out. 1850 to 59, the baptisms, that's here. It's just been published, and I think the public library has copies now on the shelves. Next year, we're going to put the early Methodist book out with Methodist records and a lot of those examples we went through. Other lost memories, it's other cemeteries that were in Cincinnati early on that no longer exist. We're going to try to recreate as much as we can from them. And then we're also working on other baptisms from outside of Hamilton County, so the remaining 18 counties of the archdiocese. So we've got lots of work that we're still trying to get done. So again, the key takeaways, I think we went through a lot. Yes, you have a question?
I have a question about cemeteries.
Sure.
Earlier on, when you first started, when you first got here, you said early meant something for period.
1850.
Okay, so in a Miami town cemetery record, it said that two people, one person was kin of someone else, and the truth is that person was the son of that second person. But what does the word kin mean then, or have you run across that?
Usually means just relation,
Well,
relative or family member.
incorrectly, though, it said that someone else was, well, another grandson of, so that foster is sort of indirectly, kin now means that, just related to it. Is that just the use of a shorter word?
Well, it's hard to say, depending, you have to look at the original record, but, I mean, it does bring up a good point, is what we interpret words to mean today was different back then. You know, a lot of times cousins, they called people cousins if they were close friends, but they weren't blood, you know, relations as cousins. Sometimes on tax lists or early you know, county records where you see John Smith Senior, John Smith Jr., they could be no relation at all, just two men and John Smith in the same town, one older than the other one, but that's not, it doesn't imply father-son relationship. So it's, you know, early on they used different words for different meanings, but I would interpret that as a family member and they're not just being specific. Maybe they didn't know. So this is just a summary. Hopefully what we've covered here in the last hour, it helps a little bit, unlock some new things to try in your research. And hopefully it was beneficial. Question back.
Yeah, I was wondering, the two terms of course Lutheran and then aggregation. And I had people tell me that they're one and the same.
Well,
but there are churches in Cincinnati that are from that root, and I always get the impression that they were more, I guess you could say liberal than the Lutheran churches. Are they distinct, I mean, terms?
so the answer is yes and no. And that could be a whole lecture in itself. But basically, in Germany in the 1820s, the Emperor of Prussia, or the King of Prussia at the time, married. He was a Lutheran. His wife was an evangelical, which again is a little bit more liberal in the theology. And his way of uniting the kingdom was he merged the church in Germany. So today, if you go there, it'll say Eve Luth Church, EV-LUTH. It's one church that's combined. So it's the Catholics and then the Protestants. That's how it exists in Germany today. What happened was that a lot of the Lutherans got very upset at that. As you mentioned, they were the more purist, the conservatives. Whole congregations just picked up and came to the U.S. Ministers and their whole congregations. So in the United States, it's two separate denominations. And you've got umpteen different variations of Lutherans today, all across the board. What happened is in Cincinnati, you see a lot of the buildings have evangelical Lutheran, or evangelical Protestant churches. Those remain distinct congregations here. And then after World War II, they merged with the Congregationists to become the United Church of Christ. So those would be, if it's a UCC church today, and you can trace it back, it would be an evangelical.